In the modern era, radio waves control everything. From the tunes in your car driving down the road to the police radio in the car that's pulling you over for not signaling your turn. These waves are undetectable and invisible to human senses, but they make up the foundation of modern connected technology. While the root of modern connected technologies may be radio waves, the underlying tech that makes radio waves possible is a rather simple concept to understand. Any person can make a simple radio in their home for a few bucks, which is part of the reason this foundational communication tech dates back to 1895. As a demonstrable introduction to understanding what radio is, we'll engage in a simple explanation of how you might make one. All you need is a battery, a coin, and an AM radio. Tune the radio to a static channel and start tapping that coin on the two terminals of the battery. You'll start hearing that tapping through the AM radio. By doing this, you'll have made a crude radio transmitter, capable of communicating in Morse code or random taps, over just a few inches though. What you're doing in this process is exciting electrons on the transmitter side, the battery and the coin, which then is received as a signal on the receiving side, the AM radio, and turned back into an audio output. What you're doing is completing a circuit between the battery terminals, which creates an electromagnetic force, which can be detected by the receiver in the AM radio. In order to understand radios in more detail than what we've just discussed, we need to take a little trip through history. Back in the early days of radio technology, in the whereabouts of the early 1900s, radio transmitters were referred to as spark coils. This was due to the fact that they create large high-voltage sparks, upwards of 20 kilovolts, to send out a signal. The issue was, the message was sent out on all frequencies in the radio spectrum, meaning that there was essentially only one localized channel. This was fine and dandy back in the days where no one was really using radio, but nowadays, do something like this and you'll get fined or sent to prison. These early spark coils were essentially doing the same thing as the coin and battery experiment, except at a much larger scale, meaning that they had a lot higher range. Riding the magic school bus back to the modern era, and today's radios use sine waves to transmit all sorts of information, from audio to video to raw data. By utilizing sine waves for transmission, radios and devices can distinguish different channels based on frequency, or the number of cycles in the sine wave per second. This allows tens to hundreds to thousands of channels on modern radios, all in the same space without too much interference. Every single radio has two parts, a transmitter and a receiver. The transmitter is responsible for taking a string of data and encoding it to a sine wave. After that encoding happens, it can also be amplified and sent out across the air. The receiver, rather expectedly, receives the radio waves and decodes the message encoded into the sine wave. Each side of the system uses antennas to radiate and or receive the signal. Relating radios back to your life a little bit, chances are you're watching this video as a result of a transmission of radio waves. Cell phones use radios in their most basic form. They contain both transmitters and receivers and can run both at the same time. In general, phones use frequency modulation, or FM, in a frequency range of 800 megahertz, in any one of 1600 individual frequencies. All of those numbers and data probably is meaningless to you right now, but hang on as we dive deeper. Back to our simple battery demonstration. We can recall that an electromagnetic force was created when the battery circuit was completed. Modern radios build off of this idea by creating rapidly changing electric currents on the transmitter side. One of the best way of doing this is by utilizing sine waves, as we discussed. To create a sine wave, radios use capacitors and inductors to vary the current and voltage in a controlled means. Transistors are used to amplify the signal so that it has a further range. The problem though, as you might have picked up, is that sine waves don't natively carry any information. They provide a foundation for transmitting information. Like the Oreo cookie is the transmitter for that delicious filling. Or like crackers are the foundations to that dry-aged Gouda. You get the point. In order to get sine waves to actually carry information, you need to modulate it. You can do this in 3 ways: pulse modulation, amplitude modulation, and frequency modulation. Pulse modulation means that you turn the sine wave on and off, just like the IT guy suggested. Doing this allows you to easily send Morse code, but that's just about it. Pulse modulation is rarely used except to control clocks across the US. The simplicity of pulse modulation also allows one pulse modulator to cover massive areas, like the entire US. Amplitude modulation, on the other hand, is what is utilized by AM radio stations and TV signals to encode data. In this format, the amplitude, or peak-to-peak voltage of the wave, is changed. You can imagine this as the wave from a person's voice being combined with a sine wave to create a new, rather complex sine wave with the same frequency, but with a lot more data inside. Finally, frequency modulation, otherwise known as FM, is used for FM radio and tons of other wireless tech. In this encoding technique, the sine wave frequency changes slightly based on the signal. This means that the distance between the peaks of the waves is varied based on the data that's trying to be transmitted. Bringing all of these different techniques back into the real world, we can begin to understand them a little further. If you sit in your car and tune your radio to AM 680, that means that the transmitting station was operating at 680,000 Hz, meaning that the sine wave repeats 680,000 times per second. The voice of the speaker or the music on the transmitting side is modulated onto that wave through amplitude modulation. Then, the signal is amplified up to 50,000 watts for larger AM radio stations and then sent into space utilizing the antenna. Your car's radio picks up that signal, utilizing its own antenna. This can be as simple as a wire or a metal stick. In conjunction with the tuner on your radio tuning to the specific frequency, the tuner starts resonating at 680 kilohertz. Called resonance, this principle allows the radio to essentially ignore any other signals in the air. The signal then passes to the detector, or demodulator, that takes the voice or music from the wave, utilizing a device called a diode, and translates it back into audio. The final step in the process is for the radio to amplify the signal so you can hear it and change the volume as needed. FM radios have different detector setups and translate frequency into sound rather than amplitude, but otherwise they operate in the same way. Data can be encoded onto a constantly changing signal utilizing different modulation techniques that have advantages and disadvantages to each method. Nearly everything that communicates wirelessly around us uses radio waves to do so, and creating your own simple radio is actually a very manageable task. Over the last century, radio has radically changed the course of humanity and rapidly accelerated the growth of the information age. In the modern era, radio waves control everything. From the tunes in your car driving down the road to the police radio in the car that's pulling you over for not signaling your turn. These waves are undetectable and invisible to human senses, but they make up the foundation of modern connected technology. While the root of modern connected technologies may be radio waves, the underlying tech that makes radio waves possible is a rather simple concept to understand. Any person can make a simple radio in their home for a few bucks, which is part of the reason this foundational communication tech dates back to 1895. As a demonstrable introduction to understanding what radio is, we'll engage in a simple explanation of how you might make one. All you need is a battery, a coin, and an AM radio. Tune the radio to a static channel and start tapping that coin on the 2 terminals of the battery. You'll start hearing that tapping through the AM radio. By doing this, you'll have made a crude radio transmitter.
Radio has been around in several forms since the first successful radio signal was sent by Guglielmo Marconi in the late 1800s. One of the perhaps lesser-known uses of radio is ham radio. While ham radio is purely for hobbyists, operators are often called upon during civilian emergencies. Ham radio is effective because you don't need a power grid in place to operate it. Similar to broadcast radio stations, each ham operator was required to have, after a successful communication with another ham operator, it is proper etiquette to exchange addresses and to send a special type of postcard, known as a QSL card. The cards here, and the equipment too, all belonged to one man. Today, ham radio is still used, mostly in emergency situations. A solitary hobby that builds bridges between people and disparate places.
We are surrounded by all sorts of invisible particles and waves, some of which are charged. And these moving charges result in electric and magnetic fields. When electric and magnetic fields couple with each other at a right angle, it results in the formation of electromagnetic waves. These waves travel in a direction which is perpendicular to both the fields. They travel through space at the speed of light, and just like light, electromagnetic waves can travel through a vacuum as well. Electromagnetic waves come in varying forms of frequency and amplitude. Even heat and light are forms of electromagnetic waves. Radio waves are part of the electromagnetic spectrum. The radio wave spectrum has a large range of radio waves, from maritime navigation signals used by ships, which are very low frequency, or VLF, to satellite signals, which are extremely high frequency, or EHF. In this presentation, we are going to focus on the HF or high-frequency radio waves and how they are used in communications. The range of HF radio waves is between 3 to 30 MHz according to the electromagnetic spectrum. The typical range of modern HF radios is 1.6 to 30 MHz. So how did we know about electromagnetic waves and radio waves? It all started with James Clerk Maxwell's treatise on electricity and magnetism in 1873. The first radio waves were detected 15 years later by Heinrich Rudolf Hertz, whose practical experiments supported Maxwell's theories. Heinrich's work inspired Guglielmo Marconi's early experiments with wireless telegraphy, using Morse code. In 1901, Marconi successfully demonstrated wireless communication from Cornwall, England, to Newfoundland, Canada, a distance of 3,000 kilometres. So the radio waves that Marconi used were the high-frequency, or the HF radio waves. How does HF radio technology work? A transmitting antenna, shown as TX, emits the HF radio waves, and a receiving antenna, shown as RX, receives these radio waves. There are 3 types of HF radio waves. Ground wave, which is good for short-distance communication at less than 20 kilometres. It follows the curvature of the Earth and is therefore attenuated. Direct wave, which can be used for long-distance communication between ground stations and aircraft. And finally, skywave, which uses the ionosphere to refract the signal back to Earth at varying angles, providing long-distance communications. As you can see, skywave covers the maximum distance. We are most interested in skywave to propagate signals. A layer in the atmosphere called the ionosphere refract the HF radio waves, making this technology work over long distance. The angle of the antenna is responsible for the coverage area as it aims the radio waves which are bounced off the ionosphere. This also creates a skip zone, where the ground wave ends and the skywave starts, where the radio waves are not present as they are not refracted into this area. To reduce or overcome a skip zone, the takeoff angle of the antenna is adjusted. By using a higher takeoff angle for the HF signal, the ionosphere is used to refract the signal back to Earth at a shorter distance. All sorts of voice, data, or signals can be sent using these waves. The ionosphere itself is made of several different layers that refract the HF radio waves in different ways. These range from the closest layer that exists in the day, called layer D, to the farthest layer called F2. These different layers behave differently in the way that they refract HF radio waves. The D layer in particular can weaken or attenuate the HF radio waves as it contains a higher number of charged particles due to the sunlight. The most common layers used for signal propagation are the F1 and F2. These layers change between day and night. A basic rule for HF radio signals is to use higher frequency radio waves during the day, as higher frequency waves will travel further using the ionosphere. The higher the sun, the higher the frequency required. The higher the frequency, the longer the distance the HF radio waves will travel. What are some of the other factors that can affect HF radio waves? Solar flares can alter the refracting property of the ionosphere. 11-year solar cycles can either hinder or improve the HF radio waves. And finally, something man-made, such as power stations which produce electrical noise, can affect the reception of HF signals. Apart from these factors, communication through HF radio waves depends on a few other things, like location, local radio rules and regulations, planning for the frequency sets to be used. So if you have the right antenna and these factors covered, you are on your way in the world of reliable long-distance HF radio communication.
Hello world. Hello world.
You 59, my QTH is North Goa. I repeat, it's North Goa. My base location is Mike Kilo 65. Over. Over. Your signal report 5555 with a QSP. I'm so glad to DX with you. Can I know your call sign, please? Yeah, my call sign is Victor United number 3, Foxtrot, Call, Juliet. Over. Victoria United number 3, Fox, Golf, and? Yeah, I repeat, it's Victor United number 3, France, Germany, Japan. I repeat, it's France, Germany, Japan. Over. Over. Victoria Uniform 3, Florida, Germany, Japan. This is 7 Zone 1 India Victor. I'm so glad to DX with you.
Increasing the speed.